of work I've done since Meltdown has come out, um, really working with leaders and organizations to help them use curiosity to solve problems that they can't solve with expertise alone. So my experience with a lot of leaders as they become more senior in the organizations, they become more senior because they are being rewarded for coming up with answers and solving problems. But then you get to a certain point where the kind of the tools you need to reach for are really tools of influence and relationship building and trust building. And so I work with leaders who are making that shift, and I work with organizations who are making that shift to help them kind of perform better, make that transition faster, but also to energize people around them to really solve bigger problems. And so today we'll kind of have a conversation, and I'll share a couple of the concepts that are sort of top of mind for me as I work with leaders. And I wanted to start with a story of kind of my own journey in some of this. I describe myself in this business as I feel like an overnight success after only a decade of trying, because I really started kind of doing this work in 2013 after leaving Wall Street, after sort of seeing the connection between airplane crashes and the financial crisis. I was learning to fly and kind of had this front row seat to the financial crisis at the same time. And then when Deepwater Horizon exploded in 2010, I realized that this was a much bigger deal than just the niche of finance that I was operating in, that these same kind of principles of sort of human performance, complex technological systems, organizational failings, misstructures, misaligned incentives, all of those things are kind of were sort of existed in, financial crisis, many plane crashes, and then Deepwater Horizon in particular. So that really made me think that there was something to pay attention to here. And then, over the years, wrote Meltdown, which came out in 2018. And, since then I work with leaders at lots of different companies, but mostly bigger companies that have kind of a global presence. I work with leaders who are trying to really create and catalyze change across their organizations. So, for me, I mean, I'm going to talk today about uncertainty, and I think we all have this pretty universal experience of being in the uncertainty of COVID, particularly the kind of early part of COVID in 2020, where nobody really understood what was going on, and none of us really understood kind of how we should be thinking about that, handling it. And for me, I had tremendous uncertainty in my life personally. I was just in the process of getting divorced, which went really well, was ultimately a very kind of good thing and an opportunity for growth for me and my co-parent. But at that moment, being in the process of getting divorced, having two kids that were sort of kind of ejected from the school system and were with me half the time. Any corporate clients that I was sort of working with or building business with had proposals in front of a couple of people. Overnight, they just disappeared. I went on unemployment at some point in that as the shutdown moved into full swing. And so it's just this very kind of high stakes, time full of uncertainty for me. And I think for a lot of us. And around that time, I had met a leader at a big oil and gas company. I had given a talk for a group at McKinsey that McKinsey hosted on systemic risk, and had met a couple of different leaders, some of whom I ended up working with later. And so I was talking with this leader who was working on a project to kind of change the way this company approached maintenance and process safety. And so it was a moment where he kind of invited me to do these webinars. And so I was doing this series of 4 webinars for him and his team. And the first couple went well. I kind of laid some groundwork about Meltdown and what we talked about in the book. And the second one, I think I had 4 that I was doing, all via Zoom, which was sort of new for all of us as well. The first one went well. The second one felt a little stilted, and I kind of didn't quite know the direction that we were taking. And as the third webinar approached, I just started feeling a lot of pressure. I started feeling this pressure to, like, here I am. I'm this author. I've written this book. This team is working on this very complex problem. I should know an answer. My job is to kind of show up and give them an answer. And so I started to feel this pressure, and it was kind of a little bit worse in some sense, because I had this emergency bedroom home office, right? Because I didn't have a home office until in this way. My kids took over my home office for all their Zoom school and stuff. So I had my standing desk in my bedroom. And so I would kind of go to sleep at night, staring at the desk, being like, I've got this thing in a week, or I've got this thing in 2 weeks, I've got this thing in a week. And I feel this tremendous pressure to know the answer. And then that made me realize that made me wonder, did this team I'm working with, did they also feel this pressure to know the answer? And so I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'm just curious if I could get a show of hands for the folks that are here. Do you all feel pressure to know the answer in your work? Is that part of your work? Do you feel pressure to kind of show up and know the answer? Yeah, I see people nodding. I see some hands going up. I see Richard shaking his head no, which I'm super curious that you don't feel pressure. That's great. And then I see a lot of people who are off video, who I'll invite to join us on video, because we're going to be putting people together in breakouts in just a moment. But so we've got this background of pressure, and we've got this, what's it like to have pressure to feel the answer in this kind of high stakes situations. And so that's actually kind of what I'd like to start with. I'd like to invite everybody to think about a challenge at their work, or maybe a challenge that they, ideally a live challenge at their work, where the stakes feel high and there's uncertainty. And I'm curious about a couple of things. I'm a little bit curious about what that challenge is, but I'm curious more about kind of what's your internal experience with that challenge. What's your internal experience to feeling that pressure? If you can pin it down, what about the challenge causes that pressure, and what kind of support do you wish you had? So I'm going to put these questions here in the Zoom chat, and then I'm going to invite folks. We're going to invite folks to go to breakout rooms for about the next 15 minutes to discuss these 3 questions. And before we do, I should put in also, here's a link. This is a kind of collaborative workbook that we can work in. So you'll see that there's sort of spaces for people to put in your answers to these individual questions. And it's a Google Doc. So if for some reason you can't access that because of a work firewall setting or something like that, hopefully the person you'll be paired with in your breakout will be able to answer that. So the things I am interested in is really this question 1 in this doc, which was, what is your experience like with this situation that feels pressure? And then question 2, if you could change one thing about your own approach to the situation, what would it be? And so you can see these kind of signposted in the Google Doc, and we'll give folks a minute to come in. So what I'd like to do right now is invite people into breakout rooms. You'll be paired with somebody, or maybe we'll do trios, especially since we've got a lot of people off video. If you end up in a breakout room and no other humans appear to be there to talk with you, just come back to the main room, exit the breakout room, and we'll have a conversation here, or we'll pair you up with somebody in a different room. So participants, do you have any, Andy? Yeah.
I'm just going to say, when you go into a breakout room, you'll probably lose what you've posted there. So copy and paste it into a Word document so you still got it when you arrive.
Yes, thank you, Andy. Or you can just click. You can also click on the link in the chat that I put in that Google Doc, and it has the question. So we'll give everybody a minute just to pull that up.
Great. Thank you very much, RJ. I counted 28 people, but I'm guessing, Chris, you don't need to be in a group.
Break.
Yeah, I can hang out. I'll hang out here in the main room in case people come back or have questions.
Great.
So breakout rooms are ready. Everybody is paired with at least one person. We do have one group of 3, but you got pairs. If everybody's ready to go, I'll send them off.
Yep. Thank you, RJ.
Yep.
So I'm just curious to open it up to the whole group. What stood out in somebody's conversation? We've got a lot of interesting stuff here, and you can keep adding stuff to that document kind of as we gather, because I know not everybody had the ability to put that in real time. But if somebody could just share sort of what came up for you all.
Tim and I talked a lot about sharing information and talking with people and listening and being with them. This is Richard talking.
Thank you, Richard.
And how that makes such a positive difference, even in a culture where maybe the management isn't really supportive. The safety people have access to more people in the organization than almost anybody else, because you can cross silos, you can go up and down levels. You have access to lots of people on this, and so you can model the behavior of sharing information, being respectful, asking people how you might help them, and doing those kind of things, even if everybody else in the organization is not doing it. But after a while, more and more people will begin to behave that way.
I love that. And Richard, I often talk and think about change as a kind of fractal process where you change a little bit and it kind of spreads throughout the organization. And I think, as safety people, as risk people, I was talking with the chief risk officer yesterday. That's one of the great things that we get to do, exactly what you're saying. We get to change how we operate or how our small teams operate, and then that change can kind of catalyze throughout the organization. But you've also kind of skipped ahead in the book, Richard, and I know you said you didn't feel any pressure, but I definitely saw folks that did feel pressure. So I'm curious, kind of when it comes to the pressure that you feel, who had something that was kind of up for them in their discussion? Thanks for that, Richard.
So I'll make a comment.
Yeah, please, Rick.
All right. So we talked about the pressure to be innovative. There's a lot of pressures right now to be cutting edge, whether it's HOP or Safety Differently or Industry 4.0. Vincent talked about it from a consulting side that's, delivering innovative services. I work for an engineering firm where there's a lot of pressure to be cutting edge, innovative. And there's so much out there in the ether around gadgets and ideas, and within the world of safety, whether it's a hard hat that has an LED display or removing safety clutter, there's so much stuff to be innovative. It just becomes hard. The pressure it's tremendous sometimes of, how do I demonstrate innovation?
That's awesome.
You don't do it by yourself. You go out and talk with people and get ideas. People come
Richard,
up
we already know that's what you want people to do. We already know that, Richard.
It works.
It's a great, of course it does.
It's easy.
And Rick, I think there's something interesting about what you're saying. And this is something that took me, writing Meltdown, which is all about avoiding failure. And then we've kind of got the flip side of it, which is, and you need to be innovating, right? And you need to be building and growing and doing all of these things. And I think a thing that I was slow to realize, but really has sunk in deeply for me, is that this complexity that you were talking about, I mean, just even reducing safety clutter, right? That's not, that doesn't exist. That's also something that impedes your ability to move things forward and to innovate, and organizational complexity and all of these things. And, and here's what I think is interesting. Innovation is a different culture than production, right? So innovation is all about, trying things and failing and collaborating with other people. Whereas I feel like production is about, kind of narrowing and sort of trimming the fat. And so in an organization that's really good at, or the polarity I actually really like is explore, exploit, right? So you're really good at exploiting, a resource, an asset, whatever it is. Being able to step back and explore and go into the space of possibilities is much harder. And you also can't mandate that people do that, right? Be more innovative, right? It's like, well, what space does that create for people to be creative? So this is spot on, and we're going to be talking about this kind of throughout the webinar today. So Vincent and Rick, thanks for that. Anybody else have anything that stood out? Yeah, Lynn.
Well, yeah, I was paired up with Helen, and we were talking about actually pressure. Sorry if you're hearing a funny noise in the background, it's my dog snoring behind me. But the pressure felt greater for us if someone else was depending on us to do it. If we were doing a piece of work for someone else, and that's where our pressures kind of felt most acutely. And so if we were doing work for ourselves, and we were allowed to be ourselves during that process, and it felt fine, but it's the responsibility to other people that was the thing in our conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that. I talked with somebody else in the break about, this idea of not wanting to let other people down, right? Not wanting to do that. And I'll just name too that, from a shaping perspective, there's a gender component to that too, right? There's a component of sort of, wanting to be somebody who is showing up and being able to be depended on and carrying this, emotional load without complaining about it and things like that. So that's a really interesting element, and a really what do I want to say here? A really rich contribution. So thank you, Lynn. I think maybe I'd like to get just one more voice in the room here. Yeah, Linda.
Hi, we were just talking about moving into new areas as well. So moving from well-established roles within a business, for myself, health and safety, towards embracing new areas, sustainability being one, where not only have you got the pressure to find out, to perform, to put in plans, objectives, targets, but also learning new knowledge yourself. So you've got the pressure internally as well as what might be perceived externally to keep up with new information and move into new areas that you've not previously really given a great deal of thought to, perhaps, and how to get those new ideas across against a background where perhaps the threat isn't as immediate as what the business is dealing with at the moment. Future proofing can sometimes seem a bit distant, can't it?
Right. Yeah, and there's really something in that because Linda, you're really talking about the kind of transition that I sort of open with, which is this transition from expertise, where you might be a health and safety practitioner who's come up through that discipline. And so if you're leading a health and safety team, you have the kind of double-edged sword of being an expert and being able to contribute, but also that might make it harder to kind of step back and empower your team to do things. But then you introduce a new area, a whole new essentially discipline into things, and now all of a sudden you can't really know the answer because you don't have the 20 years of experience in that. Now you're leading people that you have to depend on, but also shape what they're doing. So it's a really interesting area. Thank you for that. I'll add, I have a coaching client that I work with who he's in the finance, on the finance side of a pretty well-known, well-established software as a service company. And he was part of a coaching group that I ran, and then he got sort of essentially a battlefield promotion. He was leading two teams. He was leading their M&A team and another team, a kind of strategy team. And then his peer who ran FP&A, so financial forecasting, got let go because his team wasn't performing and they were missing forecasts and things like this. So it was a big deal. And my client took over this team, and now not only is going from managing 15 people to now 45, 50 people, but also one of the disciplines is something that he kind of gets because he knows about financial models and forecasts, but he's never run a forecasting team. And so a lot of our work is about, well, how do you put down those tools of expertise and reach for them when it's appropriate, because it still will be sometimes you'll still have to weigh in as an expert, but sort of shift more to kind of defining these broad metrics of success for this team, co-creating that outcome with them, and also really focusing on being influential with other parts of the business, with his peers, rather than just focusing on kind of his direct, because that's the level that he's getting to. And I think that's probably a similar feeling to lots of safety people. Richard, you said before, the thing I love about working with safety people is that they can catalyze change across an organization. And so that's a really powerful thing. But I don't think you can catalyze that change with expertise alone. So that's a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. Sorry, let me just find my notes amidst all my Chrome windows. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes, probably like 10, 15, maybe 15, 20 minutes. We'll see how fast it goes. Just sharing a little bit about kind of some of the learnings that sort of I've had, and some of the ways that I think about sort of how to take these ideas and make them a little bit more kind of bring them to life in a way that's hopefully useful for people. So can you all see this screen, the Age of Leadership? Sorry, as I did that, Zoom, of course, minimizes everybody's video and sends them
Yes,
away.
we
But
can
okay,
see it.
I
We
see you
can
can
see
see it. Thank you. Okay, so sorry, I feel like, I don't know why, but I feel like I always have to find my center again anytime I share my screen, because Zoom just moves everything around. So just give me a moment to settle in here. All right, there we are. Thank you. So when I think about this moment that we're kind of all collectively in, right? Meltdown is about this idea essentially that the world has gotten more complex. There is less buffer to deal with the inevitable mistakes, that kind of the inevitable unexpected mistakes that come out of a complex system. And that can lead to these big outcomes. And the way I think about it is, we're really not in Kansas anymore, right? I mean, in the last 20 years, Facebook didn't exist 20 years ago, right? Or it existed, in a Harvard dorm room in name only. So between, Facebook, the pandemic, technological change, I mean, the kind of the multiple, financial crises or mini crises that we've been through in the last 20 odd years, we are really in a world that is qualitatively different than the world that most of us grew up in, and the world that most of us went to school in and got our training in. That world, the kind of linear world, was focused on this idea that with enough information, you really can know the answer, and that systems are understandable. And I think the world that we are stepping into is this world where they're really, you can never have enough information, and answers don't matter as much. And I'll talk about this in some depth, because it's all about getting people to start working together in a different way. And as I said, not only does this lead to these kind of catastrophes and systems failures that we write about in Meltdown, but it also leads to these, like what Linda was just saying, these kind of cases where people are really trying to solve problems that there's not an answer for, or approaching challenges that there really isn't an answer for. And one of the things you'll see kind of come up as a theme in this talk today, and as a real theme in my work, is it's all about working with the world as it is. It's all about working with what's actually in front of us, rather than what we hope to be in front of us, what we wish were in front of us, what we plan to be in front of us. And I like Jack Welch has a quote on this, face reality as it is, not as it was or as it should be. And I think for me, this just helps ground in, well, let's deal with what's actually here, because that's the thing that always makes the most sense to deal with, whether that's not knowing the answer or resistance or what have you. And I think that when I think about modern leadership, I really kind of talk with and work with people in coaching and consulting in the courses, the programs I have on these really kind of 4 dimensions of it. One is that we need to exercise our uncertainty muscles, because a lot of being a leader these days is about holding that space for uncertainty to exist for yourself and your teams, because there are not easy answers to our most important problems. Opening ourselves to new dimensions of leadership. So dimensions of, building relationships, dimensions of working with feelings, these kinds of things really not just enrich our lives and our relationships with people, but they also make us more effective. And there's tools in here, but there's also a real paradigm about kind of how we need to think about things. And as I said earlier, so much of what we need to do to solve problems today is about building trust and influence, and really being able to solve problems in a collaborative way that's different than a technical way. So there may be technical components, but there's also this relational component to things. And then leading change. I think there's no, it's already popped up a couple of times in this discussion, but there's no leader that I work with that is not leading change as a major part of their work. And yet, so few organizations really think about how to lead change in an explicit way and have an explicit, well-developed process for it. So that's another thing we focus on. And we're not going to have time to run through all of these today. I mean, in some sense, what's on this screen is kind of a lifetime of work, and it's a journey. But I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I think can be particularly useful and helpful. So the first thing that I like to talk about is just this idea that answers are not real. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think a lot of us work to get to answers to questions, and we work to figure stuff out. And we have a problem, or we know that something needs to change, and our work is oriented around, well, how can we answer this question? And what I mean by answers aren't real, it's not, I'm not trying to be kind of dismissive about it. I mean, answers are important, and it is useful, of course, to have some kind of technical, some kind of grounding in the technology or the technical nature of our work. But answers aren't real because they live, think about where they live, right? Answers sort of, they live in an email, they live in a memo, they live in a policy. They are, what we think of as answers is like, oh, there's this problem. Well, we're going to figure out what to do. Then we're going to write it down, and then we're going to send that to other people, and then they're going to do it. So unless you can close that gap between what you've written down and what people are actually doing, you're operating in a kind of fantasy world. And sometimes that gap is easy to close because you've done a really good job with your process, and people see the value in what you're doing. Sometimes it's harder to close, maybe because the problem wasn't well defined in the first place, or maybe you didn't get enough or the right amount of input from different people in the organization. As Richard says, we need to be talking with people. And if you haven't done that, if the people that are affected by the problem aren't in the room, then you'll be giving an answer that's not real. So instead of thinking in answers, I like to think in terms of possibilities, right? So here's a challenge we have. Here are all the things we might be able to do to solve it. And moving that solution forward, I don't even really like the term solve. So moving a different approach to that challenge forward is all about exploring possibilities, putting them out there, understanding them, but more than just understanding them, working with the people that actually are going to put these things in place, working with them to make sure that they work, and not make sure that they work by asking them, do you think this will work? But make sure that they work by putting a possibility in front of them and trying them. So that moment that I discussed earlier, when I was feeling pressure to know the answer of this group I was working with, I went to our next session and said, hey, I feel pressure to know the answer here. And that makes me wonder, do you all feel pressure to know the answer? And boy, did every hand go up on that Zoom. I mean, they felt a tremendous pressure to know the answer. And yet they were working on something that was, a massive transformation at a global company. And the thing that struck me is there's no way that they could know the answer, right? Just as there's no way I could know the answer because I don't have 25 years of oil and gas experience. It was an unanswerable problem. And so what that moment did for us, when I said, hey, I'm feeling pressure, do you feel the pressure? What that really did is it let us set aside this idea that we were going to come up with an answer. And instead we got to start exploring possibilities and experiments together and experimentation together. And that group that I worked with, at the time I worked with them, they were 8 people. We sort of set them on a path to go and experiment, to build relationships and try some of the things they wanted to try and see how they worked. And as they suspected, they worked really, really well. They started to see tremendous impact. And now that group has gone from about 8 people to now 60 people. And I'm still working with them, and they are now onboarding all of these new people as they coalesce into this new team. They've actually catalyzed massive changes in how their organization works and the actual corporate structure. It's been really, really fascinating to see. And it really started by saying, well, we don't know, but what are some things we could try? And then trying those things and seeing that they work. So it's this shift from, wanting to grasp onto the answer to letting go of it and to being open to experiment. And they've run experiments that don't work too, and they've learned from those. It's interesting because, right, I think at a corporate scale, we often want to have one answer, right? But the reality is that the world is messy. And so back to kind of working with things as they are, there's not one answer that's going to work everywhere. And so what these folks are doing is playing with this polarity between being specific and getting something that works at one asset or one site, and going back and zooming out and working in a broader way. And what I like to, we talked about the uncertainty muscles earlier. I like this quote from the poet Keats, who introduces this term negative capability. And negative capability, he's talking about a brilliant man of letters like Shakespeare has negative capability. That is the capability to be in that uncertainty, to be in those mysteries, doubts. I love this phrase, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, right? That's just such a beautiful way to put it. It's not about, the antidote to uncertainty isn't certainty. It's about being comfortable with uncertainty. And that can be a real shift well, it's a real shift for me, but I think it's a real shift for so many of us who grow up in a kind of an engineering world or a world where there's a real analytical focus and we're coming up with the answer, it's hard to make that shift into uncertainty, but it's incredibly powerful when you do, because it means you can solve bigger problems faster, you can build better relationships with people, and ultimately you can really not just advance your career, but also change the way that the organization you're part of works. So that was answers. I'm going to talk now about the F-bomb. I'm going to drop a couple F-bombs. And by this, I mean feelings. I'm going to talk about feelings because that's often something that's uncomfortable. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for just a moment so we kind of have our Zoom portrait. Just notice, look at everybody who's got a picture on this screen. And I just want you to notice for one moment, you can pick somebody and just look at them for just a moment and just know that this person has feelings. And then look at somebody else and just know that this person also has feelings. And in fact, everybody on this call has feelings. And sometimes that can be uncomfortable because we don't deal a lot with feelings at the workplace. But what I want to add is you might not have your self view on here in Zoom, so you might not see yourself, but you yourself also have feelings. And boy, that can be really, really uncomfortable to recognize that and to figure out how to work with that. And so what I want to say about feelings is that in the workplace, there's this kind of, been this culture sort of over the decades. And I think about my grandfather who, came back from fighting World War II in Europe and came back from, coming back to a country that was celebrating after he had this incredibly traumatic experience in the war. And he never talked about that. He never talked about his feelings. And that kind of dissociation from those feelings, I think that really penetrated the workplace and became a part of the workplace. I think the good news is it's changing, that we kind of see that feelings matter, and there's companies that are starting to do a good job, organizations, leaders that are starting to do a good job. But what I want to say is that there are feelings in all of us. There are feelings in the workplace. Many of us it's taboo in the workplace to talk about, to deal with. Many of us aren't aware of our own feelings. I wasn't aware of them for years. There's lots of path to getting in touch with your feelings and learning how to use them. For some of us, it's parenting. For some of us, it's therapy. For some of us, it's relationships. Some of us, it's coaching. For me, it was really a combination of kind of parenting, coaching, and therapy that sort of helped me uncover my feelings. And I think, this isn't just woo-woo, right? I think feelings really matter. Feelings are important because we get them wrong so much. So feelings are really they're a perception, right? They're a perception, not an interpretation. So that there's something that's happening physiologically inside of us. They're a sensation. And there's kind of only 6 or 7 types of feelings that people feel kind of across cultures, and some are different, strong, anger, sadness, anxiety. And then we sort of, our thinking mind kind of layers a lot on top of them. It really interprets those sensations. And most of us aren't even aware of that. But we can start to be aware of it. We can start to notice, and there's a real power in that. So I'm gonna share my screen again. And of course, I'll have to do my little Zoom reshuffle. Oh no, Zoom remembers now. So I think one of the reasons it's important to talk about feelings is because we often get feelings wrong. And what do I mean by that? Well, one thing we do is we privilege certain feelings over others instead of just taking them as they are. And I do this too. I caught myself the other day asking my 10-year-old something like, "Are you sad or are you okay?" And then I was like, well, that's weird. That makes it sound like if you're sad, you're not okay. And so I kind of revised that. I was like, I didn't like how I asked that. You can also be okay, but are you feeling sad right now, and do you want to talk about it, right? So one thing is we privilege our feelings, and that's I think a mistake, because it means we're not working with what is. We privilege other people's feelings too. We want people to be happy. We don't always like dissent. We don't like people kind of kicking up a fuss. We believe our feelings too. So the thinking mind, as I said, it kind of adds stories on top of our feelings. So when we have these feelings, then we build this story. We can't quite help but identify with them. And then we often act from that position of identification. So, we get pissed off and then we want to argue with somebody, or we feel, we notice ourselves feeling agitated, but we kind of, our response to that is, instead of kind of staying with that, noticing that, it's to try to argue with somebody, basically to buy down our own agitation, right? To make our discomfort go away. So I think we often get feelings, wrong is a strong way to put it, but we don't have the right paradigm when we approach them. And I think that there's a lot to say about how feelings matter, right? And what we can do instead of kind of, falling into these three pitfalls is we can really slow down and notice our feelings. We can just notice the sensation inside us, like, oh, I have a tightness in my chest right now. We can discard the interpretations, and that really gives us the ability to choose what we want to do next. We can also, actually, I'm going to talk about embracing misunderstandings in just a second, because I want to just share a quick anecdote about a client I worked with. I'll call him Dan. Dan is a technology. He's the CTO of a fintech company, basically a financial trading firm, and he went from sort of being employee number 8 to now leading a group of about 500 software engineers. And what the transition that he has made, and I've been coaching with him for the last couple of years, it's really this transition from arguing from a place of reason to kind of working with his own feelings. And Dan had a meeting where there were the kind of partners in the company were talking about a big reorganization, and he was feeling uncomfortable with it. And what he was able to say was just that, hey, I'm feeling uncomfortable moving forward on such a big reorganization when we actually don't understand how this is going to work. We actually don't kind of know enough about the state that we're moving towards. And so feelings are really data about our challenges. And if we can go slow and notice them, it really gives us a leg up. The other thing that, that story with my client that I was talking about at the beginning, this kind of feeling of feeling anxious about feeling this pressure to know the answer, that was something I was able to verbalize, and that shifted our whole paradigm, right? Because it got us talking about a very different conversation. The other thing you can do is you can embrace misunderstandings, right? So if you feel like you're having a conversation with somebody and it's starting to get into an argument and you notice yourself feeling agitated, you can just say, you can notice that out loud. You can say, hey, Bill, John, Susan, whatever, I'm noticing I'm having quite a reaction to what you're saying, and I suspect that I'm misunderstanding something. Could you share whatever the outcomes that you anticipate with that approach? Could you share kind of you're thinking about why you think this is the right approach, or what you're seeing in the field that makes you think like this is a challenge and your way will solve it? So that's another way to deal with feelings. Use them to really embrace misunderstandings. And then the final thing I'll talk about is a sort of a variation on these two, but it's kind of being transparent and curious, being transparent about your feelings and curious about other people's feelings. So, hey, I'm feeling a lot of agitation right now, or that really stirred up some anxiety in me. I feel some tightness in my chest. I'm curious what's happening with you right now. And I know that if you're somebody, if this isn't the language you use in the workplace, this can feel like a big gap. And what I want to say is this isn't something to use all the time. And it's also not something that we can use all the time. You're human like me. And if you're anything like me, you've got some imperfections, you feel triggered by people. We're not Zen monks on a mountaintop just meditating, right? Like, we're dealing with some high pressure, high stakes stuff and a lot of uncertainty. And so we're not always able to get to these feelings. But what I want to offer you, what I want to invite you to think about is when you can get to them, you really get a powerful way of operating in a different way, and a powerful way of, it's really almost like a first mover advantage, right? Because our feelings are what come up first for us, and then we layer that interpretation on them. But if you can just stay with those feelings and say, hey, I feel uncomfortable about something we're talking about, I'm not even sure what it is, that can really unlock a group and unlock the power to collaborate in a really effective and different way. We talk about, in my work, ways of working. So we've got the strategic axis, which is what people are mostly used to working in. That's the, we've got a deadline, we're going to push something forward. The other thing I want to add there is this intimate access, which is how are we building relationships with people? And intimacy in the workplace sounds like a funny term, and I'm not talking about something that you would want to get an HR person involved in, but just this idea of, you know, building relationships and authentically caring for people, authentically caring about their experience, wanting to get to know them, not just so you can figure them out so that you can put them on the right task, but so you can understand them and they can understand you. And that kind of relationship building, that is what leads to really these opportunities for innovation, trying new things, because you've built up trust. So I bet everybody on this call knows the term psychological safety. Just quick show of hands if this is something that's kind of in your world. Yeah. So the first thing I'll say that I think is funny is, so I'm friendly with Amy Edmondson, and I used to host a podcast, and she was on my podcast, and I interviewed her about this. And the first thing she said was, man, I hate that term. Like 25 years ago, if I knew where the research was going to be now, I would call this a felt sense of candor. And I really love that, because that's really what it is, right? It's not about being nice. It's about this culture of respect and openness, safe to raise ideas, safe to raise concerns. You all know all of this. And it's a measurable behavior, right? That correlates with so many things: performance, safety, innovation, you know, adopting new technologies, all of these things. So it's really something to pay attention to. But what I think is true about this felt sense of candor, or this psychological safety on a team, we're almost always talking about how it shows up on the team. And rarely are we talking about, well, what are the behaviors that a leader needs to bring forward to do this? And those behaviors are what we were just talking about. It's vulnerability, it's openness, it's curiosity, it's admitting that you don't know the answer. In short, it's working with feelings in yourself so that you can build the capacity to be uncomfortable yourself, so you can be the one being vulnerable, sharing ideas or concerns. And that is what models and shows your team that it's safe to do that. So the research around this is great. It's so clear. And I think what I sometimes hear missing from the discussion is, okay, well, what does that mean as a leader? You can't snap your fingers. And like we were talking earlier with, I think it was it Vincent and Rick, maybe, I don't remember, about innovation. You can't make people innovate. You can't tell people to be psychologically safe. You've got to create those conditions and model it yourself. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is celebrating resistance, which as I said, change is such an important part of leadership and the leadership work that clients and the people like you are doing. And I think that there is such a value to this idea of, okay, how can we celebrate resistance? And what does it mean to celebrate resistance? Because most of us hear resistance or feel resistance, and we want to overcome it. We want to push through it. But resistance is actually great, because resistance prevents dumb ideas from happening. And I like to use this term that I made up called, what's it called? Practical empathy. Practical empathy is this idea that when we are resisting something, we don't think of it as resistance. We just think, man, I know more about this problem than they do, right? Or they're trying to impose this solution on me, but it's pretty boneheaded. That's what we feel when we don't think of ourselves as resistors. We think of ourselves as just doing the right thing. That resistance helps slow down dumb ideas and prevents them from happening. When someone is resisting us, suddenly we want to write them off. But if you can use practical empathy, you can see that for the most part, when that resistance is coming from a good place, which it mostly is, we can really learn a lot by embracing it and recognizing that that person doesn't think they're resisting. They just think they're thinking about this in a better way than what you are doing. Which just brings me to the second point. Resistance just makes good ideas better. And I think it motivates us to our highest and best contribution as leaders, because if things were easy, we would just be out there willy-nilly coming up with different ideas, doing different things. Not all of them would be great. Not all of them would work. And resistance can really hone not only our ideas, but also our ability to work with other people. And Office Space, the cinematic powerhouse, is such a good example of this, right? If you could get those TPS reports to me as soon as possible, that would be great, right? Who do we empathize with in this movie, right? We empathize with the workers who are resisting these dumb ideas from the bosses. And when you put it in those terms, I think suddenly it makes sense that, that at Initech, the people writing the code, the people writing the software were the ones that really understood the nature of the problem. And boy, would it have been better to listen and learn from them rather than impose solutions on them. So as part of this, I'll just give one kind of sort of way that I think about a tool that we can use to this, is this idea that what we need to bring to resistance is engagement and curiosity, because ultimately that's what equals influence. And I've done pieces of work with teams, whole pieces of work that are about earning the right to be right. How do you build trust? How do you become a trusted partner? And I think that work can be really, really, really powerful. So to engage with resistance, I'm going to use a metaphor of tossing a stone into the pond. And so what do I mean by this? The stone is what you're bringing to things, and the pond is the kind of reactions of the team, the individuals, the groups that you're working with. And what sometimes happens is people bring an enormous boulder to the pond, and they throw this huge boulder in the pond, and then there's no water left. There's not even a reaction to have. And this is the example if you just say, here's a new policy, here's how we're doing things. Now, I'm not talking about emergent situations where someone is about to get hurt, right? Obviously, there's an intervention to make there, but most situations, even high pressure ones, aren't that. So if there's a problem to solve, if you just throw a solution at people, then you're not going to learn anything from them, and your solution isn't going to stick. It's not going to be durable. I see this over and over as the starting points with my clients. I'm sure you all have seen it in organizations, and probably unconsciously practice this sometimes. Now, the flip side of this is throwing a stone that's too small. You just throw a little pebble in the pond, and then you don't get any reaction from it. You don't see what happens. So this is what happens sometimes when people do listening tours. And I think listening is obviously great. It's obviously crucial, but you have to have something. A listening tour is good, and you can do that. But if you actually have a problem you're trying to solve, you can't just show up and be curious about how other people see it, because you're already building a view. And if you're too open, then people will give you suggestions and ideas that don't feel right to you. You won't incorporate them because they don't make sense given what you know. But then people will feel like, well, you didn't actually approach me with an authentic curiosity. And so you'll just kind of get noise from your process, and you won't build relationships. And there's this level of stone that is this Goldilocks stone that's kind of just right. And, Richard talking about talking with people earlier, like, it's so important. This is like, hey, here's a problem that we see. How do you see this problem? Does it show up in your world? Or, I always start with that. Start with the challenge, start with the problem. Here's a problem that we see. How do you see this? Here's the thing that we're struggling with. Are you struggling with this? Or we see other groups struggling with this. How does this show up in your work? And when you can do that Goldilocks view, then you get into a place where now you're really engaging with people, you're really learning a lot, and you're building relationships, so that when you move on to having an idea, having something you want to try, now you've got willing people that are open to trying it. Oh, I put a QR code up here. I probably should have put that up earlier. This is for a free video on working with resistance. I'll also put a link in the chat at the end. So if you don't snap it here, it's okay. But working with resistance and going in more depth than I can go in here, there's 3 levels of resistance that I talk about in that video, which is from a researcher named Rick Maurer, whose stuff is just great. So more soon. I'll put that QR code up later and put a link in the chat. So with all these things, with not knowing the answer, with building our uncertainty muscles, with working with feelings, and finally with learning how to engage with resistance in a different way, the thing I want to offer is it's a practice. It's not a solution, right? So it's not a point that you arrive at, it's a journey. And I teach this stuff all the time. I live in this world of working with feelings and supporting leaders to really overcome these big challenges or work with these big challenges. And I'm constantly noticing myself slipping back into solutions mode or being reactive to my feelings instead of being transparent. And even this work on trust and how do you build trust and influence, teaching that, I'm always saying, hey, I'm up here teaching this, but this is something that I struggle with too. This is something that when I show up and the stakes feel high and I'm activated, it's hard. So that's a thing I want to add. This is a journey. It's not a destination. It's a practice. It's not a solution. And with that, I'll say thank you. And, I'm actually going to take the slide down. So I'll just put a link in the chat to that resource so you all can grab it later. And so let's see. I'm sorry. Give me just one moment of confusion as I struggle here. So here is, and I haven't been paying attention to the chat. But I see Roger's comment about a Land Rover Kalashnikov. Perfect, right? You guys are totally tracking me in this. So what are we doing now? 1 second. Okay, so I think what I would like to do is put people in breakouts for, let's see, probably for about the next 10 minutes, and then we'll kind of come into a wrap up, or maybe the next 8 minutes, put people in breakouts, and just to ask, is there a part of your work, is there a challenge you're facing where your problem would be better served by asking questions and leaning into uncertainty and experimentation rather than trying to show up with the answer? And we'll use that same kind of working document. If you just scroll down a little bit, we've got a heading for the second breakout. So you can pop in there, you can see the questions. But what I'd like to do is just invite people into breakouts. RJ, we can keep people in the same rooms. Maybe some people have dropped off, but if that's possible. Thanks, Frank. Interesting about the QR code link. Thanks for that, Lynn.
Yeah.
But let's put people in breakouts, and really this question is, are there parts of the challenges that you face that would be better served by asking questions and kind of leaning into uncertainty and experimentation? So we'll have 8 minutes to have that discussion, and then we'll come back here and kind of close and debrief. Does anybody have any questions about those instructions before we go off? No? Okay. So what's I think what I'd like to do is hear just from a couple of voices of kind of what showed up in that discussion. Is there a problem or a challenge that you face that would be better served by asking questions and kind of being in the uncertainty? Maybe somebody we haven't heard from yet.
Come on, Jim.
You volunteered me. Yeah, we talked about just asking better questions in the face of ambiguity, and when we don't have the solution, just digging deeper to understand, and then setting limits to that, and letting people work within that ambiguity, understanding, hey, here's the limit. This is the end all be all. Don't push that limit, but anything inside that, go for it. And giving the reins to the folks doing the work. That's kind of what our discussion led to.
I love that. And I talk a lot in my work about freedoms and constraints, right? And that's I think a really good thing to call out the freedoms that people might not expect that they have, and call out the constraints, so that if somebody knows there's a guardrail there, then they're able to be much more creative kind of inside of that. So I love that as a strategy to kind of work with those ambiguous situations and ask better questions, ask deeper questions. Who else would be willing to share? Anna, could I put you on the spot? Would you be willing to share?
Kind of talking about sort of things like best practice, but then sort of questioning who wrote it, or I was, who wrote it, why did they write it, what was their driver for it?
Yes.
And is it actually appropriate for what you're actually wanting to do?
I think that's a beautiful question. What was the context that they wrote it? And if the context and the driver aren't in the best practice, then how can you possibly know if it's appropriate? And getting curious about that, I think, can be really, really powerful.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
That's where we kind of ended up.
Brilliant. Any last voice that we could bring in to share?
We were discussing similar to what Tim was saying, that listening to different voices is really important to get the perspectives of people that are doing the work. But we do have that framework to work within, of legislation, guidelines, whatever company standards we've got. But also, as Tom was saying, you know, having perhaps deadlines to work within, where there's a fine line between doing things by committee, where everyone talks and everyone wants what they want, but nobody actually gets to a solution, and guiding and steering people within the constraints that we've got towards what works.
Yeah, I love that, Linda. Thank you. And that's where I think about that engagement, that process of kind of, you know, giving people enough and being curious, that can help kind of overcome that sort of committee paralysis, because you can go and have those conversations in a more, you know, in a focused and directed way, but in a way too that is still open and still really, people want to be heard, and it's very important for people to be heard. So creating that space while also letting them know that this is a thing you are moving forward, I think is that's a real smart joining of two approaches that you've highlighted. So thank you.
So how have you addressed the question where they're not quite sure what the problem is?
Yeah.
So where do you go with that?
Yeah, that's great, right? And I think particularly as, you know, if you're a safety professional, if you're a risk professional, if you're someone that, as Richard wisely said earlier, you know, touches different people in the hierarchy and different people across the organization, helping people clarify what their challenge is. And that's often just by listening to them and asking, okay, how would you know if this were solved? How, you know, what would it feel like? Like all of those things can really, I mean, it's the things that I, as a consultant, do from the outside, right? Going in, and before we ever start a piece of work, it's all right, well, what are our objectives? What's the value of this work? How are we going to know it's there? And that process really, really helps clarify things. So we're coming to the last few minutes, and I'll stick around longer if the paradigm people will continue to have me, and happy to answer any questions or have more discussions. But the thing I want to do to close is just ask for people to put in the Zoom chat, what's one thing you're taking away from our time together today, or this discussion together today? Now put it in the chat, but don't hit enter yet. We're all going to hit enter at the same time. So just take 2 minutes to put what's one thing that you are taking away from our discussion together today. One thing you're walking out of here with. So I'll give people a minute to put that in. Thanks, Anna. All right, about 15 more seconds until we all hit enter. You might be feeling pressure if you're a slower typist. That just notice that in yourself. Doesn't have to be perfect. All right. So why doesn't everybody hit enter? Celebrating resistance. Thanks. I understand what's going on. Thanks, Richard. That's very sweet.
We need to talk.
That sounds good. Connecting, rocking the pond. Yeah. Influence. Celebrate resistance. Thanks, Helen. Michael, thanks. I hope you enjoyed the book. Sanka, yeah, feelings are important. You have to embrace uncertainty. Yeah, that's right, Andy. Felt sense of candor, right? I'll put this link to the levels of resistance video. Check it out, download it. It's like 7 minutes. It's really, really useful. It's one of the things that the clients I work with, I still use it with them when they're, you know, and it's people have a lot of takeaways from it. It really helps you think about resistance in a different way and approach it in a way that feels really constructive. And so with that, I will say to all of you, thank you for your attention. And I'm delighted to stick around for some Q&A if people want have more questions. And we'll also, I think Teresa is also going to send a follow-up email with just some links. Oh, and before I forget, which I clearly did, I am just going to drop into the chat, into that shared doc we were using, Just another table. If you have questions or resources that you want to share, I'll just put it at the end of this Google Doc so you can get back to that. And that'll just sort of serve as a living document for this. Andy, I'm not sure why the video link isn't working. I just pulled it up on my machine and it worked. We'll get that sorted. The QR code didn't work. I saw that, so it's kind of working for some people. There'll be an email that goes out with the link also, so we can always figure out a way to troubleshoot it. So I'm not sure what the problem is, but thanks for that heads up. All right, so do people have questions, comments, concerns, things they want to share?
How many people have we got left? Yeah, thank you, Chris. That was great. Let's see if we've got any questions.
I think that was Linda waving goodbye there. I
Yeah,
think we've got some great comments, and you know, your question at the end, Chris, what are you taking away from this? There's some powerful stuff here, right, that you've already been through. We haven't had any difficult questions. I think somebody needs to ask Chris a really difficult question.
yeah,
Be comfortable with that, right?
yeah. I am here. I'm ready for it.
So Chris, I'll ask you one. And writing a book, I assume writing the book has been a kind of metabolized for these companies to come in and ask you to come in and do something as a consultant. Is that correct, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, that is correct. Although I think I was a little naive when I wrote the book, or my co-author and I were a little naive when we wrote the book. Mostly me. I won't put naivete on him. And I sort of expected to write it, and then, like, you know, I sort of had the bat phone ready next to my desk and was just going to wait for that to ring. And of course, that's not what happened at all. So it's been a real process of kind of talking with people about it, you know, talking in different venues about it. But also Meltdown, it's not a marketing book. Like, you know, we have some practical takeaways, but you know, some books are written like, and come work with us. It wasn't written like that at all, in part because I had no idea what the work I was doing was going to be. I just knew that this was the challenge I wanted to work with people on, this challenge of complexity. And then it took me, you know, more years to figure out, well, how am I actually going to do that? How can I be effective at doing that? But yes, I mean, it's certainly a legitimacy marker. And the people that, you know, folks like you will read the book and it will really resonate, because it really does, I think, describe something different about this current moment and the way that leaders have to work with complexity in a way that is, you know, other people talk about, but is just a conversation that needs to happen and resonate. So is that a helpful answer?
It does. You know, and two other things is I find they're entirely different challenges if you're dealing with people at the sharp end, mid-level, or executives.
Yes.
And they have their own quirks.
Totally.
And, you know, they have different kind of timelines. So, and so you're trying to come in and do something, and establishing credibility at each of those levels is different from my
That's
experience.
absolutely right.
And, so they're each a different challenge. So executives I find to be kind of an odd lot because they're deciders, right? My job is to decide.
Yep.
And so the question is, when you're trying to consult with that group, what are the challenges you find in that group?
Well, I mean, you've called it out in the question, right? And to be clear, with my practice, 95% of the time I'm working with executives, right? I'm working with executive leaders who are at this moment of transition for lots of different reasons, whether they got a new job or their responsibilities have expanded or they've been given a new challenge to work on. And the reason I said you said it in the question is because executives view their role as deciding and being decisive, and that absolutely is their role. And I you know, when I'm working with an exec, I'm always telling them, like, hey, I don't want you to get rid of that part of you, right? That is that practice, that part of you of kind of coming in, seeing a situation and making a decisive choice. That is part of what has led to your success. That is part of what has put you in the seat that you're in. But I think what I try to help people recognize is that the paradigm they're operating in has often changed. And so if they bring, it's like wearing a Halloween costume to your company's, winter holiday, your company's Christmas party, right? It's like, well, that tool is appropriate in a certain context, but it's not the right tool for this job. And so that ability to be decisive, like I was working with a leader, he's an operations manager, he runs a $1 billion facility. And he was telling me that, his team, they're not collaborating, they're not solving problems together. And as we sort of started working on this, well, it turns out that it's because when there's a problem, he solves it and then tells them what the solution is. And that's such a natural thing to do, right? And it's such a useful thing to do, but it's leading to these outcomes that he doesn't want. And so for me, a lot of working with execs is a lot about empathy. And I was on Todd Conklin's podcast a couple of years ago, and we had a conversation that is about this, like, the safety community, there is a lot of empathy for people at the sharp end. But then once you get to a certain leadership level, it's like, well, those people are just idiots. Why aren't they taking accountability? Why aren't they taking responsibility? They're greedy. But I think that's wrong. I think we need to have empathy for the execs who feel just as much pressure in different ways as the people at the sharp end. And it's I don't know, that sometimes can be a controversial view. And I'm not saying that, I think to have empathy you can have empathy for everybody. I don't think empathy is an exclusive practice, basically. So that was a kind of a long answer. How's that sit with you, Tom?
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I've got a follow-on, a little bit of a follow-on for that, a question for you, Chris. When you were talking about particularly dealing with the executives and the leaders that you work with, I'd be interested to hear what's your experience of basically your feelings slide, like when you say about why feelings matter in business, because I know a lot of people that if you start talking about feelings in a work environment, they would literally start to squirm. And
yeah, they start to squirm, right?
They would go, oh no, that's not me. They do that. That's what HR's for. So I'd
right.
Hear your experience of that, how you deal with, or how you get them to recognize this. It's a great topic, feelings in business. I love it.
Thank you. Well, I think it's actually, I'll frame it in a way that I often frame it when I'm counseling leaders who are trying to get something done in their organization, which is to find out what your bosses care about, basically, right? Yeah. So if find out what the senior people care about, and then you can, if you have a change that you see that's really necessary, figure out, does it meet with their goals in some way? And if it does, then you've now got a platform to kind of attach what needs to be done to. And I kind of think about this in the same way. I will get hired by a leader who says, listen, my team has all the data in the world, but people aren't listening to us. We're not being influential. We're getting stuck. And my answer is, well, it's because you have to deal with people in a different way. And then the feelings bit kind of naturally unrolls, right? So it's like, oh, you want to influence these people to adopt the change that you're driving? Well, you have to listen to them, and you have to be empathetic, and you have to set aside your own agenda and deal with your own discomfort of not getting this problem solved in the moment. So it does come pretty naturally, but it also makes people squirm. You're absolutely right. And sometimes that's what we talk about. Like, oh man, I'm putting this feeling, nobody has any comments about this. I wonder if you all are uncomfortable. And there's a moment where that, if you name it, it's funny, because if you name it, that discomfort turns to humor in some ways, right? People start to chuckle at themselves. And I think it was Lynn earlier who said that, I just saw in the chat that she works in healthcare. And so the feelings are a lot and they're too much. So they put those aside. And I think that there's a way you can titrate it also. So there's an optimal level of discomfort that you can give people. And that's what I try to do. I try to make people just the right amount of uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. And they generally kind of come around and sort of.
Not everybody. Yeah, for sure. Not everybody. Right. But it's part of the journey, and it's part of the growth. Yeah. And if you are going to be leading change in, across hundreds of people, like, you really need to recognize that there are feelings. And so the ones that do the work and the ones that see the goal and want to hold on to that. And ultimately, I think the ones that are successful are the ones that does start to sink in for them. And it's a practice, like I was saying.
I think you mentioned earlier, Chris, there's like 6 or 8 base emotions that cut across all geographies and cultures, and trust and fear and anger and joy.
Yep.
All of those kind of things. And what I found in my career and my own personal experience is if they're angry with me and don't like what I do, I don't get engagement. And when you talk about why don't you just be more curious? Curiosity is a mixture of joy and trust. So if I don't make you feel good and you don't trust me, I'm never going to get curiosity out of you. So I have to change, I have to understand the emotions that sit behind the behavior that I'm seeing, because I need to change the way that you think before I can change the way you behave, which is kind of on me first.
That's right. And I think that's a really powerful thing to say. Feelings drive behavior, right? It's not the other way around. We think our paradigm is the other way around often, but it's feelings that drive behavior. And so if somebody's angry with you, that's maybe a place to start, right? Like, hey, you seem really angry at this thing that I brought you. Like, tell me about that. What's that like, right? And it's hard to do, right? I had a client who, working in different parts of his organization, different cultures in these different business lines, just had somebody yell at him for like 2 minutes. I'm going to use an impolite word here. Horseshit ideas, like this kind of thing. And he told me afterwards, he debriefed that. He's like, I just sat there. He's like, I just took like 2 minutes and just sat there silently and didn't do anything with it, because that's what he could do at that moment. And he said, earlier in my career, I would have been arguing, I would have been going back at that guy, and it wouldn't have been effective, right? So, but I just sat there, sort of blew himself out. I made it clear to him that behavior wasn't okay, and that if he were to, I didn't want him talking to my team in that way. And then we moved on. We moved on with kind of our problem solving. And so it's not that you're going to be best friends with all of these people, but it's that they're humans and these relationships matter, and feelings are an important part of that. Helen, I noticed, I think I noticed that you were going to say one other thing to kind of maybe close your question. Did I get that right? Do you have something you wanted to share?
No. Yeah, it was. That's fine. It was covered. Yeah.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, I've got a hard stop. I've got to go. Chris, absolute joy to listen to you. Thank you so much for coming on. Really,
you're welcome. Great to be here. Really, really fun. So thank you.
John, Claire. Bye, everyone. Cheers.
Bye, Andy.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Anka. Yeah, thanks, Tom.
You, Tom, while I'm talking to myself. It looks like everyone's dropping off. I don't know if anyone else has got any questions for Chris.
Thank you, Chris. It was good to hear.
Yeah, good to.
Richard.
I've just got one. Since you said you usually work with senior executives, there's something I was wondering about. With the amount of research that's been done into things like the dynamics of control rooms and flight decks and workplaces like that, has an equivalent amount been done into the C-suite?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's not technical research, no, but that's something that I talk about a lot. Like, how do we pay attention to process, right? Because leaders are so, I could have a whole nother talk about this, but leaders are so steeped in the content of what they're doing, the engineering questions, the safety questions, the production questions, that almost no leader, that occasionally I'll work with leaders, but most leaders are so strong in the content. And when it comes to the process, when it comes to how do we work together, what are our norms, how do we make decisions, how do we make different decisions, sometimes people know who's responsible and who's accountable for what things, but it often ends there. But the truth is that there are good processes and there are less good processes to get to a specific goal and outcome. So I think that, I don't know of any research on, how to design workspaces or things like that kind of would be the technical equivalent, but the kind of moral equivalent for me is, well, how do you run a well-structured process? How do you get a team to solve a problem? And that's often what I am facilitating. It's often what I'm teaching people to do, kind of by modeling it and sort of implicitly. So is that responsive, Roger?
Yes. Another thing that's just made me think of, you talk about the teams, like implying that they're the sort of the technical teams. What about how they work with the support staff? You know, like the executive assistants and other kind of helpers.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, and I'm really thinking about that right now, because I've not done much work directly with EAs, but they're such an important part of, you know, that kind of support layer is such an important part. That's actually not true. I did a project with do you all know Ruth Denyer at Netflix? Do you know her at all? So she does production safety with them. And Netflix has this whole coordinator layer that's kind of, you know, people that sort of get stuff done and put the pieces together. So when I was working with Ruth and the broader safety team at Netflix, a significant amount of my work was with that coordinator layer in parallel with that leadership layer, because there's absolutely something there. And I know in my own business, my EA and I, we are, you know, a partnership, and the way we work together really helps get things done and advances what we want to do, and is great. So there's a long-winded answer, but right now I'm creating a product that's kind of designed to take leaders through this journey in a sort of self-paced way, but that it also has some interaction. And one of the things I've been thinking about as part of that is, well, what can we offer for a leader so they can work with their EA more effectively? Because I actually think that that's a really important part of being an effective executive. So thanks for the question.
Thanks.
Thanks, Roger. Oh, Michael, go on.
Can I ask a quick question, Chris?
Of
Well,
course.
kind of hang at the end. I hate holding people over, but I didn't want to get too in front of it. I'm very interested in finishing your book. I do tons of books, and something that I've noticed that I think about often, that Jack Welch quote, I think he referenced the past, the present, and the future. And I'm thinking, I've been at this company for 32 years, so I can look back from when I first started to where I am now. And it seems that just a quick thing to say, if we were to take all of our practices and everything that we do now, and if we were to have that 32 years ago, I wonder if we would be a better company or not. And
right.
I have this impression, and this is my own verbiage, the way that I look at it, we're devolving as a society. I think as we improve one thing here, right, maybe technologically, safety wise, the human is like devolving, right, being lazier or more careless because there's that something there. And I'm curious your thoughts. I'm very curious on finishing your book. And I was wondering, as a side note to you, where I knew you from, and it must have been from Todd's podcast. That had to be.
Maybe that's it.
Because I knew your name. I'm like, I know this guy. Why do I know this guy? When you said Todd, I was like, I bet you that had to be it. So what I'm curious about, and if this is even actually a question, do you ever see us actually getting in front of it, or we always just be improving here to give a little bit of more cushion here, more leisure, more slack, more what we really want to do, right? I mean, wouldn't we rather just be sitting on a beach having a pina colada, right? But no, we have to go to
evidently
work.
Not.
So I'm curious about your thoughts about the future. Again, if I could go fast forward to 32 years from now and bring them here, would that actually be an improvement, or would we find more spots? Do you have any thoughts about that, really?
Yeah, I do. And some of them you'll find in the book, and some of them are sort of still evolving. So I think in the book we talk about, we have this term called the paradox of progress, which is like these technological innovations, we don't want to throw them away, but we need to think about them and manage them differently. They really do give us something, but they are not without a cost, which is, I think, what you're saying. If we were to just take what we have now and you know, there's a cost to what we have now. So to the extent that if all we do is technical innovations, if all we do is come up with new technologies, analyze data better, you know, use AI to predict safety outcomes, blah, 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 blah. If that's all we did, then I do think we would not be better off in the future. Because I think you're right. I think there is this kind of compensatory behavior. And more than that, I would say these technologies, these tools, these approaches that we take, you know, they are linear and they do not acknowledge the complexity of the situation very often because they're not the right format. Like trying to watch a DVD without a DVD player, right? You've kind of maybe got it there, but it doesn't actually do what you want to do because it doesn't acknowledge the whole human, and it doesn't acknowledge the complexity of the human. And my real goal, I think, when I think about my work, whether it's in safety or with engineers or with lawyers or whatever, my real goal is to make work more humane and make work better. And so I do find myself being optimistic that we are in a moment where people understand what's been lost, or some people do, and we're starting to see these kind of shifts across the board. I mean, you look at somebody like Brene Brown, right, who's built her career around writing and practicing vulnerability. I mean, I don't think that could have existed in the 1960s, right? I don't think that was a sort of conversation that we were ready to have. But I am kind of pessimistic about our traditional approaches to be able to solve these problems, but I am optimistic that we actually are in a moment where we can really open up new dimensions. We can start thinking in terms of not thinking, we can start being in terms of being in relationship with other people, building stronger relationships, solving harder problems in a collaborative way. And that's kind of my hope, that we are at this moment of what I see optimism in my work.
Follow-up question to that, and then I'll be done.
Please.
Do you think what we're doing is to get ahead of the curve, or what's going on? Or do you think all of our work, all of us, like on this Zoom, everybody is representing some aspect of business and safety? Do you think we're just doing it to keep up because we see this need? Hey, we're sinking, and we need to add some bolster to what we got? Or that'd obviously be different for everybody, but how do you see yourself of getting ahead of the curve, or just trying to at least be on the curve?
Yeah, there's this term in aviation, and I'm probably there's this term
I have the impression that we're belling water sometimes just to stay afloat.
So if you look at this graph, so this is speed on the horizontal axis and drag on the vertical axis. So
Right.
there's this moment in the flight of a wing where, as the airplane slows down, you actually need more power to go slower, and it's called being on the backside of the power curve. And
that's interesting. I don't think I've heard that yet. I don't think.
Right, it's pretty interesting, and it's pretty counterintuitive. And to answer your question, Michael, I think a lot of people in safety and in other places are on the backside of the power curve, where they are kind of working harder, but that work is generating consequences that require them to work more and to work harder. And so I think what's needed is, the good news is I don't think you're stuck on the backside of the power curve. The challenge is, I think you need a different mechanism. You need a different paradigm, which is sort of what I've been talking about today, right? Kind of abandoning the search for easy solutions, working with feelings, working with resistance, learning to engage with people in a different way. And for me, for my money, that's kind of what can transport you from one side of the power curve to the other, because we sort of know that there's no way that our safety practices are scalable, right? As our organizations grow in complexity and scope, as our work grows, as the technology involved grows, we know we can't just throw more safety people at it, right? And at some point, the marginal safety resource slows you down, because now you've got someone else you need to coordinate with. So I think there's this real, what is needed is a fundamentally different approach. And I think that's the way that we're going to get out of this sort of regime of bailing water, as you put it.
Well, something very interesting that I really enjoyed out of your book is the story on night.
Yes.
All of these stories are interesting. In fact, I'm at the one where the nurse gives the 38 pills to someone. But the thing on night is very impressive, where this guy's just chilling on his couch and life is smooth, which again, we want to be on the beach, right? We want to be where that guy was. And then all of a sudden these things go haywire.
Yes.
And they go into red alert. And anyway, I'm gonna finish your book. I appreciate you because I love stuff. I love these stories. There's lots of, and I'm gonna check out this movie, 5 Days at Memorial. I got that pulled up. I'm gonna check out all the stuff because I enjoy all the stuff, and I appreciate your time, and especially for going long. This is long, so I appreciate it, and I thank you very much.
My pleasure, Michael. Thanks for your participation, your curiosity, and yeah, look forward to connecting again some point.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Roger. Okay, that's it's probably lights out for us now, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you all.
Your breakfast, Chris, if you haven't already had it.
I have not had my breakfast. I have a little snack here, and then I've got some calls, and then I'm going to go get breakfast. So I'm
Excellent.
going to take
Okay.
myself to the diner down the road.